Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back. It's been a couple of years since I was here last. So before starting, very briefly, if you want to know more, there's a course on LESS, which is this. Some of this is part of that. If you haven't have enough of conferences yet, there's another one next week in Berlin, which is hopefully good. Also the slides, although they will be given to Susie and on the, I guess, the site there, they will also be available on the LESS site. Not this one, because this one was in New York, but the one for Prague. Okay, so the talk that I'm going to hold is called Maximizing Dependencies with Interdependent Teams. And this talk is kind of an created out of frustration with the continuous recommendation to try to isolate the teams so that the teams can work completely independently. Something that I believed a while ago was actually a good idea, and since then I've realized it's actually not a very good idea, but it's still promoted a lot, and therefore I ended up creating this talk. And one of the things I've learned a while ago is that one of the better ways for doing talks is to try to maximize the usage of storytelling. So I'm going to try to use that also. And just to share the power of storytelling, I'd like to just start with a very short story. I think I shared this story like 4 or 5 years here also again, but I guess most of you have forgotten that, if you were there at that time. So this is a story of I used to live in Singapore, but I'm originally Dutch. And this is a story of my oldest son when now he is like this, but then he was like that. And at that time he was going to his swimming lesson, because especially as Dutch people, swimming is a key skill. So he had his swimming lesson, and we were driving back from his swimming lesson, and we're stuck in traffic in Singapore, we're stuck in the car, and he's sitting in the back, and he's looking at the traffic ahead, and he says to me, "Papa, I want to go faster." And I told him, well, that's very nice, but it's not going to happen, because we're stuck in traffic, and we can't fly over it, so we'll be going at this speed. But then he looked at the other side of the road, and on the other side of the road, there was no traffic. So I pointed to the other side of the road and said, "But they are going faster." And I said, "Yeah, they're going faster, but they're going in the wrong direction." Right? We have a choice here. We can either go slowly in the right direction, or we can go really fast in the wrong direction. So what do you want to do? So he thought it over a little bit, and he said, "I want to go really fast in the wrong direction." No, at that time I thought it was just funny, but then I arrived home that evening, and I realized that short story is about the best description of our industry I can imagine. Because I work with a lot of companies, and often the requests are, we want to increase efficiency, we want to increase productivity, the teams are not delivering enough output, without asking whether we're going in the right direction. So one of the things we try to do with LESS is not so much focus on productivity and efficiency, but more on trying to maximize value delivery, trying to go in the right direction. Now, as I mentioned, this is just an example story, but one of the problems with stories is that they always make one point really well. And in this talk, I wanted to make multiple points and share stories from my experience. So what I decided to do is I decided to make up a story that is kind of the combination of all of my experiences to somehow create a story out of that makes more points than any single experience. So that's what we're going to do. And for that, I've used Lego to kind of visualize that. Real people were too hard to put in certain positions. And I thought this is great because I can, put the minifigures in certain positions together with my son. Unfortunately, his patience lasted 5 minutes. So I spent 2 days putting all these figures in certain positions eventually. But I'm going to share this talk. I'm first going to share the story of these 5 teams and how they work and how they're solving problems. It's kind of a combination of how I see a lot of teams work. And it will feel hopefully quite intuitive and easy way of working. And that will probably take about 1/3. And then after that, the rest of the 2/3, I'll be talking about what kind of things do you need to do, what kind of things do you need to put in place for that kind of working to actually work. Now, in this talk, you will need to be able to recognize the people from the different teams. So we have 5 teams. Some of them are easy, like the mean people are criminals. The police people are Team Power. The bathing suit people are Team Lake. So far, easy. The other 2 are a bit harder. So the people that kind of look like people still are Space, and the ones that clearly do not look like people anymore are Halloween. So that's how you probably want to distinguish them. Now, the product that they're building is a system that I worked on a couple years ago, a management system for higher education. So they do course registration, scheduling, all the administration, etc., etc., etc. And what I have here is the top of the product backlog. Now, before I dive into that, there's something important happening here, which is actually quite common in less adoptions. And that is the top of the product backlog has small items that teams can easily pick up within one sprint. But some of those items are very much related to each other because they came out of one larger theme or feature, and in the refinements, they were broken up into smaller items. And then what happens is these smaller items start to kind of mix, right? So you have the top of the backlog, a list of items where some of them are very related because they originate from the same, what we in less sometimes call ancestor, and some of them are quite unrelated. So the 3 larger features that they're working on is the registration on courses without having a login. So this is especially when, for example, you would register for a course at another school that you are not a student yourself, that you don't actually have a login to that system. We have a migration to new tech, and we have an integration of an external component called a scheduler. So here we see that if you look at the first 2 items belong to this course registration, and then the 3rd item belongs to that scheduler, the 4th item to the tech, the 5th item again to the course registration, the 6th item to the scheduler, etc. So we had 3 big items. The big items are split into smaller ones. The smaller ones, priority-wise, kind of start mixing, and they end up being the top of the backlog. Now we'll be looking at these teams working on that, and the main problem that the teams are having is that they're just beginning this course registration without an account larger feature. So they haven't ever worked on it yet. They've done the refinement of that, but now they're starting their sprint planning. Right? And the sprint planning looks like this. And what we'll see here is all of the 5 teams together in one room. And they are using a technique that we often use in LESS, which is called put the cards on the table. It is super advanced. you use, unfortunately, a lot of people use Jira for product backlog, but Jira has like two great features. One, you can attach photos, and two, you can print the items so that you don't need to use Jira. So that features, and they made the printing actually pretty good. So usually you print the items on cards, you put it on the table in priority order, and you see the teams around this, and the teams are now given the top of the backlog. Just a few obvious points. Obviously, there's only one backlog for one product, and not a backlog per team. That would be extremely silly, because then it would be called team backlog, and it's not called team backlog, it's called product backlog. And similar, obviously, there's only one product owner, not a product owner per team. That would make absolutely no sense, because it would be called team owner. And it's not. So you'll also see the product owner in most of these slides. You can recognize him in the back with a red hat and a mug. I guess that's how I imagine product owners to look like, with a red hat and a mug and sitting in the back drinking coffee. But you'll see him in most of the slides there in the back. So the teams here are looking at that top of the backlog, and together they're talking about how to solve the key problem that they're having, which is that top of the backlog. And in this case, it's this. They're starting this course registration, and the criminals team, they've worked on course registration in the past. Right? So what is happening here is we have the representative of the criminals teams and the criminals behind that. And the representative looks at the first item in the backlog and says, the first item in the backlog relates to course registration. We have worked on that in the past. So why don't we pick that up? Because we know most about the systems involved with course registration. And it seems logical that we'll do that. But then what happens is the police team, again, the representative there with the team behind it, they're having a conversation, and they say that's not a very good idea, because if we look at the top of the backlog, there's a lot of course registration coming in the future, and you guys know most about it. But there needs to be at least 3 or 4 teams working on this because of the amount of work that will be coming. So therefore, we suggest that we'll take up that first item because we don't know anything about it yet, but we need to know something about that, and you guys can help us out during this sprint. Right? So then what happens is they look at that backlog, and they discover first item is viewing, second one is course registration. So therefore, the criminals say, well, normally, we know most about this. Viewing is the highest priority item. We want to make sure that that one is done, so let us pick that up. However, they say, viewing is actually quite good for learning this area. So why don't you guys pick it up anyway, even though it's the highest priority, so that you can get comfortable with that. And then we'll pick up this second item, course registration, for us, which is a little bit harder. Right? And in the meantime, the Lake team says, I think we are ready to start working on this course registration too. So then the 5 teams together look at the top of the backlog and the course registration, and they make sure that they do not give the items to one team, but they actually balance the related items over the criminals' power and the Lake team. In the meantime, we have the Space and Halloween team in the back. And they said, if all of us start working on course registration at the same time now, in the same sprint, that's maybe not the best idea. So let us take each of the teams take one scheduler and one new tech, and then next sprint or the sprint after that, we'll start also looking at that course registration. Right? So the effect of that is that they talked about which teams is going to work on which items, but also how they're going to learn from each other, because most teams are new to this course registration. The criminals team will hold a quick introduction to course registration for the other teams and kind of points out to likely where they need to make changes in the system for their items. So each of the teams pick their item and they end up in the first part of what is called Sprint Planning 2 in LESS. And what you see here, this white thing is obviously a whiteboard. And we see all of the team members around that. And what they're doing here is they're checking where in the system they're going to work at the same time. Right, so on this big whiteboard, they basically draw a quick sketch of their architecture, and they take the different items, and then each of the team kind of marks the places where they are likely to work this sprint, so that they can already notice when two teams end up in the same part of the system. So, for example, what happened here is that they noticed that the external scheduler feature and the payment of the course registration, both of those relate to accessing external systems. And because of the security reasons, all of the access to external systems actually goes to a part of this system, so therefore both of them will need to make changes to the external access components. Right? So they discovered that, and they'll talk a little bit about what each team, what change they need to be making to make sure that they're not making similar changes at the same time. This only lasts like 30 minutes. Actually, this usually lasts less than 30 minutes because it's not that hard. And then this usually also takes about 30 minutes. But then after that, they go to the second part of Sprint Planning 2, where now we see each of the teams, they're having their own Sprint Planning 2, and they're talking basically the same as in Scrum, but they're doing it at the same time in the same space, so that they can do some quick syncing. So for example, in the first part, the Halloween team discovered that they need to change this component that accesses external systems. And while their team is at that, one of the Halloween simply turns around and says to the space team, "Hey, are you guys going to make this firewall configuration change, or are we going to do that?" And then the space team says, "We were planning to do that." And then the Halloween team goes like, "Okay," and then assumes that the other team will do that, even though if they'll need it first, then the work would move within the sprint to their team. But for now, they don't need to plan it twice within that sprint. Also, we see, of course, the product owner, again, being extremely involved in the planning. And we also see some of the teams who just grab the computer to check out some things, some information they're missing during their planning. Now, after their planning, each of the teams is ready to start their sprint, and this is their office space. Luckily, they still work within the same office space. And each team has their own table, but one of the things you'll see happening here is that there's a lot of pair work going on. In fact, nobody actually works alone. But one of the interesting things about the pair work you'll see between the teams is that a lot of the pair work is cross teams. Right? And this is actually pretty obvious, because if you remember, the criminals Power and Lake team all picked up items related to course registration. So their work is very closely related, and therefore the teams will cross-team pair or regularly have cross-team discussions, etc., etc., etc. Let me not spend too much time on this. And the last thing, so after they worked for a couple of days, they have their refinement. Refinement in LESS is always done in a multi-team way with all of the teams together. Usually this lasts quite a few hours because you do a lot of analysis and clarification during the refinement. One of the advice we usually give is to not prepare for refinement, because once you prepare, you'll only end up with the one guy preparing, telling all the other people what he prepared, and it will make your meeting extremely boring. So not preparing kind of equalizes that and lets that preparation, that learning, just happen within the refinement. Now, here we see the product owner taking a little bit more active role, and what you see over there, that's obviously a projector. So he's projecting the product backlog there, and they were taking the items of the product backlog that they need to clarify, split, or estimate, which is the three activities you do in refinement. So the product owner says, we would like to clarify this particular item, again, likely related to course registration, because there's a lot of work coming from that. And then the teams here have formed what is called mixed-up groups. Right? So, and if you look carefully, each of those mixed-up groups contains at least one person from each team. So the refinement is not done per team, but it's done mixing all of the teams together. And the effect of this is that all of the teams now have at least one person who knows most about each of the items in the backlog. So therefore, in sprint planning, truly there's no pre-assigning of items to the teams. We can truly just give the top of the backlog to the teams and say, you figure it out, how you are going to solve this. Now, each of these mixed-up groups is clarifying different items. After that, they'll centralize and they'll briefly summarize their clarification so that everyone knows at least something about all of the items in the backlog. Again, which enables that collaboration that you saw earlier in the sprint planning. Now, I'll leave the story for what it was here, and instead move to the second part of this talk, where I'm going to talk about what do you need to do for people to work the way as I just described. Once you're working that way, it feels super intuitive and natural, and you'd be wondering why the rest of the world is not doing it if it's so obvious. But the reason is that you do need to put a couple of things in place, and putting those in place tends to be hard in organizations. So I'm going to talk about those next, and I kind of go from the more abstract principles towards the even the technical parts that you'll need to do. But I'll start off with what I've come to call the two journeys that most teams need to go through. The first one I'm not going to talk about a lot, which is the being told how to work to becoming a self-managing team. And this should be a part of just naturally adopting Scrum. However, a lot of teams in Scrum are not particularly good at being self-managing teams. There's a lot of improvement that can be done there. But the one that I want to talk about, which is harder in a way, is the programmer to product developer journey. And I'm going to spend a bit more time on that. Most teams, when they start a less adoption, the people in the team have what I call a programmer attitude. And the naming is terrible, but I haven't figured out a better name yet. But I'll explain it. So programmer attitude is the attitude that my job is coding. And somebody else's job is to tell me what to write. Right? And what I do is I listen to somebody else, maybe a user, customer, maybe an analyst or product owner. I just listen to them carefully, and then I'll create whatever they said. And if I create the wrong thing, then clearly something was wrong in somebody who said the wrong thing to me. Right? Most teams tend to start there, and unless this is not useful, so one of the biggest changes towards product developer. Now, the product developer attitude starts from, the why do we do this perspective, which is we're building a product for a user and customer to solve a particular problem. However, most of the time, our customers do not understand technology very well. And because they don't understand technology very well, we cannot and should not expect our customers to just tell us what to do, because anything that solves their problem requires knowledge of their problem and knowledge of what is possible with technology, because that defines different solutions. And we can't expect our users to know the technology, know what's possible with it, and simply tell us what to do. Right? However, product developers, you ought to be, people in the team, you ought to be knowledgeable about what is possible with technology. So therefore, as a product developer, it's your job to understand the customer's problem and their domain. Right? Because you need to use your knowledge of technology, what is possible, to together with customers and users come up with the best possible solutions. And therefore, clarification is not a one-directional communication, but it is a bi-directional communication where the team, together with users and stakeholders, figure out what are the best solutions to the problem that users are trying to solve. Right? So clarification should be super interactive, and as a developer, you're not just on the receiving side, but you're together discovering what solutions are the best. Right? Now, this journey from programmer to product developer comes for most developers as quite a shock, and is often quite painful, because it's quite comfortable being just told what you need to write, and then not so much being involved in creating those features yourself. So this programmer product developer journey is a big whatever the word is. Big journey. Fine. Okay, now less consists of experiment guides, rules and principles, and we'll start off with some of the principles and then go into some structure and then some practices. These are the principles, but I only want to share two principles that you heard a lot within the story. And the first one is whole product focus. And the two principles that share seem kind of obvious, but they're not. And if you reapply them all the time, you'll get kind of a very interesting way of working. So whole product focus basically means that we want people in a team to realize that the whole product is more important than their individual team's work. In other words, all of the team can finish their parts, but if it doesn't work together, everyone will lose. And we always need to have that whole product focus rather than your individual team focus. Now, the way this works in LESS, as you just heard, is we have this one product backlog. And in the one product backlog, we never ever pre-assign items to the teams. Right? So the teams have no idea what they'll be working on next or next sprint. Right? They really have no idea yet. It's left completely open. And because of that, it automatically broadens that view of the teams to the whole product. Right? And then in Sprint Planning 1, the teams together take the top of the backlog. It's not the individual teams that go and grab the items that they're going to work on, but it's the teams together who say, okay, we together are going to make a next increment of our product, and we'll need to figure out which teams can best work on which items and how are we going to collaborate. Right? So all the time they have that whole product focus. Then if you look at the refinement, by using those mixed up groups, what happens is that the teams actually start analyzing and clarifying features that they're not going to build themselves. Which seems like an enormous waste, of course, because why would you spend that effort? But doing so actually makes you understand that larger product much better. And that enables the collaboration between the teams much more. Now, the second one is customer-centric, right? Where, well, partly the journey I just described from programmer to product developer, one of the things we try there is to move the teams much, much closer to the customers and users. And as we'll get in a moment, the teams are also feature teams, which means they take complete customer-centric features and do whatever they need to do. Right? That's where they had that larger architectural system, because the teams don't work on one component, but they work across the system on features, and they need to discover where the teams are going to work on the same parts of the system. Also, by having one product owner and never having product owners per team. Terrible idea. I don't know why people started that. But not having product owners per teams leads to the teams interacting directly with customers and users rather than having in-between people that are responsible for stories and acceptance criteria and other nonsense. Right? So that way we'll create much more customer-centric teams. Now, the big change for many organizations is the change from component teams to feature teams. So with component teams, in LESS, we refer to teams that are organized around the technical architecture. So teams own parts of the system. And with feature teams, we mean teams that take on complete end-to-end features. Now, the best way to explain this is not using the slide, but to actually explain some of the problems with component teams and then create some feature teams right here. So let's make some teams first. You guys, let's start with a system. So let's start with just the simplest example. Imagine we're building a system that has a front end and a back end. So we need two different teams. We need a team working on the front end and the back end. And we have this amount of people here. You guys sit in the right place. You now belong into a team. Do you want to be a front end or a back end team? Front end. So this team here is a front end team, and you guys till here. Otherwise, the team gets too big. Sorry. Sorry, you're the back end team. Yes, you are. Don't worry. Later, you'll have choice. Now, we'll have one product backlog, and in the one product backlog, we put customer-centric features. Now, unfortunately, our customers are kind of annoying because they don't choose features that require an equal amount of front-end and back-end work. In fact, our customers don't really care about the front-end or back-end. They just want some features, right? So therefore, some of the features require more front-end work, and some of the features require more back-end work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that wouldn't be much of a problem if at least our customers would balance out the amount of front-end heavy and back-end heavy features. But they don't do that either. They really don't care about it. So what might happen is that now, on the top of the backlog is a lot of front-end heavy features and not much back-end work for those. And then a little bit lower priority is more back-end work. Now then what starts happening First, the obvious thing, taking a step back, what starts happening is we have dependencies between these different teams, right? And a long time ago, I thought dependencies between teams is the biggest problem to solve. And I've realized I was wrong. Dependencies between teams is not a problem at all. But what is a problem is called asynchronous dependencies. And that's the one we've just created here. Because this team has a lot of high priority front-end work, and this team has lower priority back-end work. So what will happen now is that this team will start on, from their perspective, a high priority feature, but that feature also requires work from the front-end team. But the front-end team is not going to work on it right now. Because from the front-end team's perspective, this feature is not the highest priority. The dependencies are not at the same time. They're asynchronous. So what happens now is that this team will do their part of that feature, and they will leave it within the system half integrated. And then a couple of sprints later, finally, this team is going to work on the feature that that team worked on a month ago. Right? So they do their part of this feature, and they'll integrate it with the work that that team did a month ago. And will that work? It's not likely to work, right? So therefore, this team starts interrupting this team. This team starts interrupting, that team starts interrupting this team, and this team will be super annoyed about that, right? Because they've completed this already a month ago, and they're working on something else. So it's an annoying context switch from this team's perspective. So what happens is because the teams are because the dependencies are asynchronous, it actually causes a conflict between the team members. Now, there's a lot more problems related to this setup, which I'm not going to talk about now. But what we do in LESS is we don't create teams around front-end and back-end, but instead we create what we call feature teams. So let's do that. You three, can you please move there? And take all your things with you because it's a permanent move. You three, please move there. Come here. You need to go there. Oh. Yeah.
My server.
There we go, done. Right, and organizations make such a fuss out of this. Now we have two feature teams which have both front-end and back-end developers in the same team, which is great because now what we can do is we can just take a feature from the backlog and give them to this team. And this team will need to do both front-end and back-end. Then we take the next feature and we'll give them to this team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now there's no dependencies between the teams anymore. Solved. We'll get there later. Well, actually, there are, of course, still dependencies between the teams, but now they're different. Because now, here we have some front-end developers, and they're front-end developers, and they're starting to work within the same components in the same sprint. In the same sprint. And this is a key point, which is these dependencies are now always synchronous. Right? Whenever this team makes a change in a particular part of the front end, then they only have a dependency with this team when they make a particular part in that, make a change in that particular part in the front end at the same sprint. Right? If they make this change a sprint later, they'll need to work maybe on top of the work of the other team, but there's no dependencies between them. So now all of the dependencies are synchronous, and because they're synchronous, it promotes collaboration between the teams. It becomes now a benefit of both of the teams to work together rather than a context switch and a conflict. Right? So synchronous dependencies are pretty good because they actually enable cross-team collaboration, Whereas asynchronous dependencies is what everyone thinks dependencies are, and they're just annoying because they let you wait, they cause conflict, they cause interrupts, etc. So no wonder that people don't want that. But instead of trying to change the dependencies from asynchronous to synchronous, most of our industry said, oh no, dependencies are bad, we need to start isolating the teams. But the teams are working on the same product, and therefore isolating the teams is actually not a good idea, because that will be visible within your product and will just cause extra work. So to summarize that a little bit, we have component teams, feature teams. We have two types of dependencies, asynchronous ones that cause interrupt, synchronous ones that cause collaboration. Now we can also talk a little bit about the maximizing dependency part, because maximizing dependencies is what we refer to as the habit that you saw within the story of the 5 teams, where they purposely distribute similar features over multiple teams. Right? So traditionally, you might have, say, 3 course registration features. And you have one team, the criminals, who knows most about course registration. So traditionally, you would say it's most effective if we give these 3 features to that one team, because then they can work alone to that. But many teams in less don't do that, and instead they say, we have 3 similar features. Let's purposely give them to 3 different teams. Right? Because if we give them to 3 different teams, we'll actually maximize the synchronous dependencies between the teams within the sprint, and will enable much more cross-team collaboration. Now, why would you do that? Most teams do that simply because it's a lot more fun to work cross your team with other teams, when that is not you negging the other team, but when it's truly collaboration. Also, it reduces the higher level WIP, work in progress, on your development, and therefore it increases your larger organization's agility. Because now we can have 5 teams working on this course registration all at the same time, which means we can take that bigger feature and reduce the cycle time of that significantly. Now what this leads to is what we call interdependent teams, where the teams are not isolated teams anymore, working on their own microservice alone, but instead we get this cross-team shared learning. Now, one of the things that most people miss out on feature teams is that I actually love working in feature teams, specifically because it gives me more choice. Right? Because if you're in the backend team, what work do you do? Backend work, right? You have no choice. All of the backend work will always go to your team, right? But with feature teams, it works differently. Because what we had in sprint planning, we had these 5 teams. And what sometimes will happen is that maybe the criminals team says, we are sick and tired of course registration. We don't want to do it anymore. We want to work on the migration to new technology. Then the other teams will probably be surprised and say, oh, but okay. And then they have that ability to pick and choose, of course, as long as it's in collaboration with the other teams, and as long as it's the top of the backlog, choose which areas they're going to work on. Now, I'll skip this. If we dive a little bit further into the technical practices, one of the biggest enablers of this is that teams need to work, developers need to learn to work more incrementally. And this is simple to put it on a slide, but believe me, this is like one of the biggest obstacles for a lot of even just basic Scrum adoptions, which is the ability for developers to break down work into very small incrementable steps. Right? It seems so simple, but it's very, very hard for a lot of developers. But you need to be able to do that if you want to do continuous integration. And continuous integration is one of the key enablers to have the teams collaborate. Right? So continuous integration means that you are able to break down work into small steps, and then you're continuously integrating. So not an automated build and test, but continuously integrating. On the trunk, main line, no branches, no pull requests. Pull requests are branches too. It just delays your integration. So you're continuously making small changes. And one of the reasons why this is so important is because it is also continuously sharing your work with each other. Right? So if you work cross-team, when you just integrate, people get that immediately, and it enables this cross-team collaboration. Now, one of the other practices that we sometimes use is a practice called communicating code. 3 minutes, don't worry. So communicating code, where because now teams work across the different components, this is a screenshot where in, unfortunately, Teams, we created a channel per component, and then whenever you, in the beginning of the sprint, you would join the components that you're going to make changes on, and whenever there's a commit, it will go bleep, bleep, and you'll be aware of all of the other changes that are happening within the components that you're working on. So when he commits, it goes bleep, bleep, and I go like click, and I go like, oh, he's doing changes in the same part as me, so I'll go, hey, we need to have a chat about that. And again, this kind of technical practices enable that close collaboration between the teams. Don't branch. And then the last practice that I'll mention to get even more technical is stop having millions of tiny code repositories, but move towards the practice of mono repositories, where you put your entire product, or if you wish, all code in your company, in one large repository. And there's nothing new to this. Companies like Google, Facebook, they've been doing this for years. They originally built their own internal tools to do that, but gradually they're open sourcing more of these version control tools that are built around mono repository ideas. So, to wrap up, this talk was called Maximizing Dependencies with Interdependent Team. It started as a reaction to this independent team bullshit? No, I didn't want to say that. Suggestions. And as a reaction to that, maximizing dependency here refers to the practice of teams picking up very closely related items, distributing them over multiple teams so that you maximize the cross-team collaboration within the sprint. And with that, you'll end up with interdependent teams, where teams are constantly learning from each other, building one large product. And I believe my time is just up now.